This is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Paul Hollander. He's a professor emeritus of sociology at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and he's a longtime teacher in the sociology and social relations department at Harvard. He's born in Hungary, same year that I was, turns out. He got his BA from London School of Economics and his PhD from Princeton in sociology. He's, I think, was first best known for his book Political Pilgrims in 1989. And it's, I think, fair to say that the theme of his work has been, you might say, the sins of 20th century intellectuals. Let me mention some of the other books that he's done: The Many Faces of Socialism, 1983, Survival of the Adversary Culture, Decline and Discontent, Anti-American Critiques, Political Will and Personal Belief, Some Discontents, Postmodern and Post-Communist, The Only Superpower in 2009, and his latest that I talk a little bit about today, has recently come out from Cambridge Press, From Benito Mussolini to Hugo Chavez, Intellectuals and a Century of Political Hero Worship. So, Paul Hollander.
Thank you, Harvey. It's a great pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me. This is not working and my voice is not very strong, but I hope you can hear me. I appreciate this invitation, partly because I have, as Harvey hinted, I had some emotional connection with this area. In fact, on this very space, I once had an office in what was then the Russian Research Center, and I was a fellow at the Russian Research Center at the beginning of my academic career, while I was an assistant professor in social relations. So this talk and the book, which is the focus of the talk, reflects my very long-standing preoccupations, which obviously have a lot to do with my background. And as Harvey said, I grew up in Hungary. I was born in Hungary and grew up in Hungary, which was not a very pleasant place to be between the two world wars and after World War II. So I had some personal experiences with Nazism and as well as Stalinism. And I escaped after the '56 revolution. And after that, I led a rather calm academic life, contrasted with the life in East Europe. Well, my preoccupations have been fairly consistent. I sort of started out as a Sovietologist and wrote about the Soviet Union. And then I became more interested in the Western, especially intellectuals' perception of communist systems. And more generally, I have become interested in the connections between intellectuals and politics, and also interested in the interactions or the interdependence of the personal and the political realm, you know, like in my case, how personal experiences influence political interests or attitudes. So I wrote a fair amount about these matters. Anti-Americanism is another reflection of the same interests. Much of it really dealt with, about the attitudes of American intellectuals toward their own society, in addition to intellectuals and other groups around the world. Now, this current book I am trying to discuss briefly indeed was similar in some ways to Political Pilgrims, in that it reflects this long-standing preoccupation with intellectuals and politics. And beyond that, my interest in how people deal with a huge amount of political power, like these dictators who ran these systems. And well, as to the spiritual discontents of modernity as in the title. Well, that's a very broad way of looking at this matter, and I tried, perhaps unwisely, to make some huge generalizations about the motivation and the background of intellectuals who were attracted to these very dissimilar, in some ways dissimilar, in some ways similar political systems, you know, the communist ones and fascist Italy and Nazi Germany and some others in the current Arab world. So actually my view of Western intellectuals and their political misjudgments or misperceptions was based largely, not so much as some other people argued that intellectuals wanted to have power, but my judgment was somewhat more charitable. I thought they were idealistic, and they wanted to do good or help people they perceived as doing good. I don't think they actually wanted power. Well, some of them did, but most of them I don't think did want to have power. I mean, they wanted to make some difference. They wanted to have their ideas to be taken seriously. But anyway, so these are some of the similarities. I also, of course, came to the conclusion that certainly when I started working on political pilgrims, the prevailing views of intellectuals have been altogether too rosy and indulgent, and the kinds of views, I can't resist quoting one of them, at least one example. This is from Edward Said and what he said about intellectuals. He said that the figure of the intellectual as a being set apart, someone able to speak the truth, a courageous and angry individual for whom no worldly power is too big and imposing to be criticized and pointedly taken to the task. And he also said that further on that the real or true intellectual is always an outsider living in self-imposed, seamlessly integrated exile on the margins of society. And of course, this didn't exactly apply to him being on the margins of society as a university professor at Columbia and having many of his books made into required reading on many campuses. But I think this was a kind of exalted view of intellectuals, and I think many intellectuals still would like to think that perhaps this applies. I have always been criticized about overgeneralizing about intellectuals, and so I hasten to add that it's hard to know, what proportion of intellectuals in Western societies, including the United States, should be the subject of this kind of criticism, because after all, we don't have opinion or attitude surveys addressed to intellectuals as such. And all we can say, that there is a large and vocal portion of intellectuals, mostly these days in departments in the social sciences and humanities at American and other Western universities, who may be characterized in the ways I have characterized them. Now, as to the personal and the political, well, that's another interesting issue, because, of course, on the one hand, we would like to take the position that our personal experiences, that our work in some ways should be independent of our personal experiences, that it should be objective or impartial in some ways. But I think this is difficult to come to a satisfactory conclusion, because obviously I can't say that my own personal experiences with Nazism and communism make my work irrelevant or questionable. Of course, it has made me judgmental. That has been, of course, a problem in our academic world in the last few decades. We have been cautioned many times not to be judgmental. But of course, if you look at this matter more closely, you find that everybody is judgmental, including those who advise us not to be judgmental. Only people are judgmental in a selective way. And I don't think much can be done about this. Now, as some of you may remember, in the 60s, the predominant idea was that our personal background determines our political outlook. So, for example, that people who suffered discrimination, whether on ethnic or racial or gender grounds, they are more trustworthy witnesses to these matters, and therefore we should pay more attention to what they have to say. So that the personal determines the political in a desirable way, makes it more authentic. Well, again, sometimes this is true, sometimes it is not true. And as I said, I pondered this matter given my own background. I don't think that one's personal background necessarily validates one's political beliefs. So I am still talking about the general concerns which I had over my professional life and how they are reflected in these two books. I might say another very general interest I always had between deception and self-deception, or illusion and reality, and theory and practice. So I have always been, you could say these are somewhat morbid fascinations, with political propaganda or advertising. And I think, actually, over the decades of my work, I increasingly came to the conclusion that, unhappily enough, human nature is largely irrational, that human beings can believe an amazing number of absurd things. Political, religious, non-religious, all kinds of things, How I think Americans, in some ways, maybe this is, we can blame advertising for this, that Americans have this great optimistic belief of shortcuts to various desirable states, good figure, attractiveness. Well, you just have to look at advertising. As I have always been morbidly fascinated with this. So appearance and reality, this is certainly something else I have always been interested in. And even I used to teach a course on the sociology of literature. And there again, many of my books were selected on the basis of to what extent they told us something about appearance and reality. And actually, I have one book which is totally different from all my other books in that it's completely unpolitical. This book about the American approach to romantic love, which is partly based on some classical works of literature, but most of it is based on the more recent internet attempts for people to get together. And I have been always greatly impressed by the importance of these romantic hopes we all entertain. But let me say something now about the specifics of these books. Well, again, I could also say that all my work, or much of my work, represents this durable preoccupation with what is called in the title spiritual problems, or the discontents of modernity, or the unheroic aspects of modernity. I argued at some length in the beginning of this new book that many of these intellectuals were attracted to these dictators because they personified incarnations of a heroic approach to life. Now, that was, of course, in some instances there was more basis for this than in other. Castro was a very good target for these sentiments. Whether Stalin was, that's more debatable. But I think that I have been very much aware of what I think Daniel Bell said, that the main problem of modernity is the problem of belief. That even in this country, where it seems that a vast proportion of the population claims to entertain religious beliefs, but I really don't think these religious beliefs do much problem solving of the problems of a spiritual nature. Although people will say in opinion surveys that they, or a large proportion, an amazingly large proportion of Americans say that they believe in heaven and hell and meeting all their friends and relatives in the heaven and so forth. I think these are enviable beliefs, actually. But I think we have a kind of a religious vacuum. And I think that the political, and this goes back a long time, but I think even in this society, which seems ostensibly much more religious than other countries, in the modern world, like the rest of Europe. So, I mean, there is a problem of a lack of meaning and the absence of larger purpose, and you can associate this and blame it on modernity. And of course, one of your colleagues, or former colleagues, wrote the famous book about bowling alone. That's the same topic, Professor Putnam. So I think that modernity contributes to, well, the famous idea of alienation and also a kind of low-grade, unappeasable indignation. I think that applies to intellectuals. But then I have been tempted, at least I had a couple of pages in the preface to this new book, to say that somehow these attitudes now seem to apply to the present-day followers of our great president at the moment. That he has now the types of followers which in the past, well, obviously focused on grievances and resentments. I think these are two major motives which led to the popularity of dictators in the past and which fueled the popularity of Mr. Trump. But he has very few intellectual supporters, so he wouldn't fit into this volume. But I think his ordinary supporters somewhat resemble the supporters of Mussolini or Hitler, somewhat. I mean, obviously it has to be qualified very carefully. So anyway, these have been some of the persistent interests of mine. I have also been interested in the idea of the concept of totalitarianism, which is out of fashion, partly because there are hardly any totalitarian societies left except North Korea, I suppose. Now, as to the, again, one common denominator of the intellectuals dealt with in this book, though I should leave this to the end, that they all proclaim to have a sense of mission. And so they met certain quasi-religious needs of their supporters. Now, as to the differences, because also the people who blurbed my book, they also mentioned political pilgrims, and I would like to also draw your attention to the differences. Well, in political pilgrims, I only talked about communist societies, communist, in the sense that, not communist, that they achieved the high levels of abundance and community, and the withering away of the state. Of course, they weren't communist in that sense. We just called them communists because they were ruled by communist parties and because they legitimated themselves by some version of Marxism or Marxism-Leninism. But anyway, in this book, I included non-communist systems and their leaders, such as Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, I already said, Saddam Hussein, theocratic Iran. So that's a broader focus, because I was interested again with what struck me as a kind of a secular religious or quasi-religious motivation of intellectuals. And again, the focus on political hero worship. Well, I mean, this is really a bizarre phenomenon, and I don't know how many of you ever read any of the specific aspects of this kind of political hero worship, which actually prevailed in these countries where these dictators were in power. And I think it's important to make a distinction between the hero worship of people like Hitler and Mussolini, who I believe were genuinely popular, at least in the earlier part of their reign, and the popularity of Stalin or Mao, which is more difficult to ascertain, I mean, even in retrospect. But I think that what also I found amazing is this astounding contrast between the perceptions and the images of the dictators and their actual personality, insofar as we know about their actual personality, but I think we know by now a fair amount. Now, obviously these leaders were essential for the emergence and the survival of these systems, so they played an important political part. What I haven't done enough, I did a little bit, but not enough in this book, compare the attitudes of the intellectuals who were admiring the leaders in their own country versus those from abroad. I mean, I made some comparisons, but not enough and not systematic enough. And I think most of the genuine admiration came from abroad, because the intellectuals in their own countries, again, it was somewhat different with Hitler and Mussolini. I think they managed to prolong the positive attitude of their own intellectuals longer than intellectuals abroad. So that would be an interesting question, but obviously intellectuals who lived in the Soviet Union or China under Mao or Cuba's Castro, they were able to separate, illusions from reality, and like the general population. It's also interesting, probably some of you know this, that some of these leaders were definitely charismatic, exactly in the sense Weber meant it. Hitler and Mussolini and Castro were definitely charismatic. But it's interesting that Hitler, as the Germany began to lose the war, he made fewer and fewer public speeches, and he was sort of losing his charisma, I suppose, even in his own eyes. Well, let me mention some major findings or conclusions of this book. I thought one of the more interesting one was that admiration of these quite different dictators was somewhat similar as far as the intellectuals were concerned, because they admired more their personalities than their actual policies. That they met this need. They were heroic people. They were of course philosopher kings. I think that was perhaps the most important attraction for the intellectuals. This perception that they were philosopher kings, and the intellectuals, of course. I mean, the dictators are very anxious to feed this delusion, and they were anxious to have some more than others. They had long intellectual discussions with some intellectuals, and they wanted to display their own wisdom for the intellectuals who were susceptible to that. So I think that was a major attraction, the philosopher king image. And the other one was, well, this is really related, or almost the same thing, that intellectuals saw these dictators as overcoming this terrible gap they were so concerned with between theory and practice. That they were doers, not only talkers. And intellectuals, of course, many intellectuals had this great fear that they were just talking and not making any difference to the world. But the dictators obviously made a huge amount of difference. Now, so again, I think that when you read a lot of these descriptions of when intellectuals actually met these dictators, I think it confirms this point I have just made, that they admired them for their personality, for their powers, for their apparent authenticity, for their wise use of power. I mean, these were all fantasies. But also they had this image of the Redeemer, a sense of mission, wise father figures. Somebody used this term, I forget now who, that they were revolutionary idealists. A lot of good things combined. And they of course very often compared these dictators to politicians in their own society. And of course, they had a great deal of contempt for politicians in their own society because they didn't have any kind of charisma and sense of mission, and they were willing to compromise, and they were just petty and not concerned with the major issues of human life. Another important appeal of these dictators was that they were claiming the capacity and the intention to transform human nature. Well, that's almost, you could say, well, this is a kind of a quasi-religious, well, depends what religion we are talking about. I mean, it was obviously a highly implausible aspiration to change human nature, but communist leaders were especially prominent in advocating this. Well, Nazis is a different story because, of course, Nazism was not a universalistic ideology, and they already had what they're supposed to be this kind of elite section of human nature, the Aryans and the Nordic Germans. So they already had this basis. They had in some ways, I mean, this is another interesting matter about these dictators, that communist dictators had actually a very negative view of human nature in the short run. And that's why they felt that they had every right to coerce and oppress human beings because they had no idea what's good for them. And but in the long run, of course, the long run was something totally different. And I think in the Nazi case, and I know much less about the Italian case, this contrast wasn't so obvious between the short run and the long run, because Hitler certainly felt that he already had a large number of idealistic and committed supporters, and that, unlike Lenin, and for good reasons, Hitler didn't feel so isolated as Lenin and the other early communist leaders felt, for good reasons, who didn't have much popular support, and they knew it. So, just to summarize again some of these attractions, which I think these leaders share. Of course, there was also the Renaissance man image. I mean, this was the most extreme with Mao. Mao and his swimming, besides being a poet. And Hitler wasn't much interested in the outdoors, but he liked to contemplate the mountains from his retreat in Berchtesgaden. But Castro very much a Renaissance man, certainly. I mean, you know the meaning of Renaissance man, that again, highly developing all your talents and abilities, physical, mental, artistic. Of course, they were also, all of them, interested in art to some degree. And what was most important, this is a very unspecific point, but it keeps coming up. I think what was most important in the admiration of these dictators, as far as the intellectuals were concerned, that these people, the dictators, had good intentions. Now, you would think that intellectuals who are normally concerned with, normally display this unmasking impulse, and they always suspect that there are underlying motives in the normal familiar setting. But as far as the dictators were concerned, they were surprised, they were satisfied with this idea that they had wonderful intentions. And that was the most important, even if they didn't succeed in realizing those intentions. Well, of course, as I said already, another important point which I didn't mention before, that these dictators were also seen as somehow succeeding in melding, in bringing together tradition and modernity. That somehow they managed to preserve whatever was supposed to be good in a traditional society, certainly the sense of community. And or they would create new communities, and that there would be no alienation in these societies. This was obviously very appealing for the dictators. And they believed that the intellectuals too would be much better, or were already very, very well integrated into these societies. So, I mean, this, of course, would have been a unique accomplishment to really bring together the traditional and modern aspects of traditional and modern society. But again, just let me give you just another example of the religious imagery of some of these intellectuals had about these dictators. And I won't be talking much longer because I will be interested in your questions. But here is a well-known American, I mean, I don't know how well-known, probably those of you here of the older generations, he was well-known. I.F. Stone, the journalist, who was reputed to be hard-nosed fact finder and social critic, I.F. Stone. And this is what he said about Che Guevara. Now, to be sure, Che Guevara is not in the same category as Castro and Stalin, but he was a prominent communist leader. And so this is what I.F. Stone said about Che Guevara. In Che Guevara, one felt a desire to heal and pity for suffering. It was out of love, like the perfect knight of medieval romance, that he had set out to do combat with the powers of the world. He was like an early saint, taking refuge in the desert. Only there could be the purity of the faith to be safeguarded. Well, Che Guevara was, of course, subject to a great deal of idealization. Not all of it had this religious coloration, because he was martyred, and he was doubtless he was an idealist, no question about it. And his idealism allowed him himself personally to execute people whom he considered traitors. And he was certainly not corrupt. I mean, that's another interesting distinction. Most of the dictators I have written about were not particularly corrupt in the sense of wanting to have, many palaces and vacation homes and a lot of young women. When Mao liked young women, he was an exception. But most of the rest of them were not particularly interested in women or sex. They just wanted power. So anyway, this was an interesting comment, I thought. And then Sartre said about Che Guevara that he was the most complete human being of our age. And this is another interesting comment, that the most complete human being, because this brings us back to the preoccupations of the 60s, wholeness and completeness, and how widespread this was. And this was, of course, in a way, this goes back to Marx, because, as you well know, Marx didn't care much for the division of labor, and there wasn't supposed to be any in communist society. Everybody was supposed to be Renaissance men and women in communist society. So that was interesting, this perception that they were coal men, but that's like the Renaissance image. But there is really one more point I wanted to make, which I think there is one interesting, well, I think it's fairly interesting. One explanation that why were so many of these intellectuals so unhappy with their own society, and of course it was this unhappiness with their own society which predisposed them to find a lot better societies, more impressive societies, who would satisfy their high expectations. And I don't know how well known this concept is these days, or how much is it used. This idea of relative deprivation, which goes back to this American sociologist who used to be very famous. He wrote about relative deprivation in the 50s. Robert Merton was at Columbia. And well, he wasn't using this concept to explain the dissatisfaction of intellectuals with their own society, but of course it can be very much adapted to that. And the gist of the idea is that our own assessment of our own life is based not so much on objective, tangible, indisputable realities, or including deprivations, but on comparisons. that we compare our situation to others in what is considered our reference group. But now the reference group, in more traditional societies, reference group was your own kind of people who occupied the same social status, but of course now the reference group can be anybody. And I think also, but I don't think Merton emphasized that this relative deprivation also has a lot to do with individualism and American-style individualism and these very high and dubious hopes about self-realization and the possibilities of self-realization. So in other words, intellectuals are the kinds of people who find that their society is terrible. As I said, this is my interpretation of Merton's view, because they compared it to some ideal. Look at the Declaration of Independence and then look at the realities of American societies. And so people can make two sets of comparisons to people they know. Well, this has to do with more pedestrian matters, about your income or, style of life or success achieved. That some people in my class got a job at Harvard and others at much more inferior institutions, and so that makes me feel terrible, someone might think. But I think intellectuals are more likely to think in theoretical terms, that they are familiar with certain ideals and theories which promise certain possibilities. And people who are critical of American society always say, but this is such a rich country, how could there be poverty? And look at these early aspirations at equality, what happened to them? So that's relative deprivation, as distinct from, deprivation because you are really repressed, because you live in a police state. And that's a different. I also felt that this whole concept of repression is also has been greatly expanded. Relative deprivation also has to do with notions of repression, I mean. So I think intellectuals have high expectations. Now, of course, what I have never succeeded in clarifying, and I will conclude with this, that why some intellectuals fit these characterizations I outlined now and others don't. In the concluding chapter of the book, I have a long list of intellectuals who never supported repressive or autocratic political systems. Now, I don't think it's enough to say, well, they were smarter or they have, well, of course, those who had certain personal experiences, that would be easier to understand. But there are many intellectuals, the famous New York intellectuals, who had very similar life experiences and family backgrounds, and some of them became, leftist, left of center, others conservative or neoconservative, and not easy to explain. So I hope somebody someday will shed light on these matters, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thanks very much. What have we got in the way of questions? Yes, Peter.
Thank you, Professor Hollander. I guess my question is, I drew two somewhat different ways of distinguishing, characterizing how these intellectuals differ from ordinary people who didn't make such horrible mistakes. Two ways of thinking about the fundamental psychological difference or orientation. One could say that the intellectuals were more idealistic and moral, and therefore more ready to be deceived, almost kind of eager to be deceived.
Yes.
Or alternatively, one could say that it's not that they're more moral, but that their moral impulse is somehow unsatisfied because they don't believe in the old religion and gods, and therefore they're right to be deceived by new ones.
Well, I think this is all true, what you said. And again, if you look at the historical periods, as I did in the Political Pilgrim book, well, obviously the intellectuals who idealized the Soviet system were witness to the Great Depression, when the Western capitalism completely malfunctioned. And so that was a very obvious inspiration to admire the Soviet system, which had no unemployment and inflation, etc., etc. And again in the 60s, when we had this new outburst of idealization of not the Soviet Union, but systems like Cuba and China and Vietnam, Well, the problems of the 60s were, of course, different. They were not like the Great Depression, but the Vietnam War and civil rights and gender inequalities, etc. Again, people felt there was again a great outburst of high expectations which were not met by American society, and there was hope or belief that these problems were solved by other countries which were admired. But I think I remember another quote I read recently or reread recently as to what attracted intellectuals. Oh, well, these were not intellectuals. I was thinking of a group of people called the Venceremos Brigade. These were mostly college students who went to Cuba and cut sugarcane and demonstrate their support for the regime by putting in this manual labor, which they would never do in their own country. And one of them, they said, or several of them, they said that what impressed them in Cuba, this was in the 60s or 70s, that people were not thought of as being part of raw relationships, that they were treated as individuals. But this was a major reproach, again, to Western or American society. This is like the division of labor, the denial of wholeness. If you are in a raw relationship, you are thought of in terms of your social background or occupation or ethnicity, etc. So individualism played an important part in this propensity of intellectuals to admire societies in which they thought that there were better prospects for self-realization.
Yes, Jim Hankins.
Yes, thank you very much for your remarks. I'm in the older period of Western history, and it strikes me one of the differences between the earlier period and later period is that modern dictators and tyrants are often themselves intellectuals, whereas in the earlier period that's not the case. I mean, Machiavelli aspires to devise the Medici that he wanted to aspire to were not intellectuals. They had a decent education, but they were not resident Medici. And if you go back to antiquity, Xenophon obviously depicts Hiero as someone who's not a wise man, he listens to Simonides, the wise man. Plato tries to educate Dionysus, but fails. So the intellectual, in a way, has more putty to work with in the ancient world. Most of the leaving aside Roman dictators, most of the Greek tyrants are military leaders. They're not philosophers. So the ancient philosopher really believes, like Plato, that you can make a huge difference if you can get inside the head of the tyrant. But the modern tyrant is himself an intellectual figure. Mussolini liked to keep the complete works of Plato and Aristotle in his desk, so you can see it when he came into it. And he actually knew them quite well. He was a real intellectual journalist, and he went up like what he thought, but he was certainly had credibility. And of course, Stalin had a theological education, and Mao was an intellectual. Hitler was an volume-based intellectual, but he certainly wrote books. And does that make a difference? Does that make a difference to the kind of frustration of the modern intellectual that they want to get inside the head of the tyrant, but they can't actually, because the tyrant's already got a lot of things inside of his head. He's not as malleable as an ancient.
And I think this made a difference more in regard to the aspirations of these dictators who had these very high aspirations to fundamentally change their society and possibly human nature, and I think that had a certain appeal. And that's what separated them from ordinary status quo-oriented politicians who had no such aspirations.
I was, and following on this, interested in your estimation of relative intelligence of the dictators, never mind the intellectuals. Which of them are the most intelligent? I think Stalin is supposed to have said of Hitler, an able man, but not first rate. Which of them, and by the way, this might distinguish them from Mr. Trump, who seems to have ordinary intelligence.
Yes, I mean, obviously, also all these people we talked about, they were certainly well read, and even Hitler. And they were very successful in impressing intellectuals with their own knowledge. But I think what, again, intellectuals found the most impressive is this, that they had also a hold on power. They had idealism and power. That was the great combination.
What about Chavez?
Well, Chavez seemed to me more like Mussolini. He was certainly charismatic, and he impressed people with his good intentions, and he was supposed to be a kind of a Renaissance man with all kinds of interests and activities, and I am the least well informed about Chavez compared to the others. And of course, he, in a way, his aspirations to change society were more moderate or modest. And he was very popular to begin with. So there was less blood on his hand, I think, for the reason being that he didn't try implement these radical social changes which people objected to. I think that's a major source of political violence when people try to, like these leaders, these dictators, they try to bring about social change, which people really basically didn't like they take the collectivization of agriculture in the Soviet Union, where the peasants didn't want to be collectivized, and, so they were very badly treated as a result. And
What about which of them would you say was the smartest? Would you maybe Stalin, or the most successful murderer?
most successful murderer? Well, there were different styles of murder, you know. I mean, the German case was unusual because it was really, you could say, well, that was the most modern murder because of industrial aspects. But of course, you could blame far fewer people being killed by the Nazis than by the various communist systems, which murdered people in more primitive and, in some instances, more indirect ways, like having them in these forced labor camps where they had to work hard and got little food and little clothing, and so they just had a high mortality rate. So that's,
Starvation.
Yeah, so that's different. And of course, Pol Pot, we didn't talk about Pol Pot, but there was another murderous idealist who wanted to totally change Cambodian society. And he was very much apparently impressed by some notion of the wonders of a traditional society, since he didn't want people to live in cities. He abolished cities.
Carly.
Thank you. Continuing the question of the difference between modern dictators, ancient dictators, and medieval ones, do you think this relationship between the intellectuals and the dictators and their admiration of them, and also the phenomenon of these dictators wanting to be enacting as you call them, revolutionary idealists, is a distinctly modern phenomenon? And if so, do you have a suggestion about why we find these in the modern age as opposed to, say, like the ancient dictators and the tyrants who were sort of more petty, low-grade, they didn't really aspire to be
Well, because they were more products of traditional societies. So they acknowledge some of the limitations of a traditional society, what you can do and what you should do. So they didn't envisage any kind of fundamental change in the social system, let alone changing human nature. So their aspirations were more modest to moderate.
Alberto and then Reggie.
I think my question is a kind of follow-up on earlier question, and it is about modern dictatorship and especially the role played by ideology. So my question is whether, from the sociological point of view, we can say that the attitude, the stance of the intellectuals was affected by the kind of ideology, or that there was a recurrent pattern. And I'm asking this because I think that the idea that intellectuals who supported those dictators did that because they were idealists is easier to be accepted for some progressive ideologies, but much less if we consider ideologies which are usually regarded as regressive. And if I may, I have a second question, which is about the need of dictators, of intellectuals. So intellectuals were surely attracted by dictators, but even more than that, perhaps, and I think you mentioned this, but I would like you to explain this a little bit further. Dictators desperately needed intellectuals because the legitimacy of their rule was, to put it mildly, very unclear, and so they needed more than other leaders, intellectuals, in order to perform that function.
As to the first question, it reminded me of the famous quote, much quoted Solzhenitsyn point that you need ideology to do evil on a large scale. I think this is very true. You can't do it without ideology. A large scale have to be underlined. How many people can you kill just to get their money or property, or because because they made a move on your wife or something like this, personal? Very few. You need ideology to kill a lot of people who are seen as obstructing, the good things which were supposed to be carried out. And now what was the second point was about?
About the need of...
Oh yes, I have a number of quotes in this book about the rather negative view Hitler and Stalin Hitler and Lenin had of intellectuals. They acknowledged that they needed their help, but they held them in contempt. Especially Lenin and the Russian intelligentsia, and there was this long-standing stereotype of the Russian intelligentsia as all talk and no action. So no, the dictators didn't think well of intellectuals, definitely.
Yes, Rick.
One of my questions was to have you deal with the term that so often comes up in discussing these matters, useful idiots. But I suspect you just did in your previous sentence. If not, I'd love it if you would enlighten me further. My problem personally is to be too obsessed with the news of the day, so I would be interested in anything you might say about the fact that the most prominent American in the last, at this time, who has expressed admiration for dictators like Putin or Duterte is Donald John Trump. And of course, Trump is not an intellectual, but certainly Stephen Bannon is a man of ideas. I'm wondering if you can shed any light on my contemporary musings of that kind.
But you could also have added among those Trump admirers Erdogan of Turkey, another unsavory character, and Orban of Hungary, who likes Trump. So they have much affinity with one another, these people. Incidentally, Stalin and Hitler also thought well of each other. There is much evidence on that. But as to why, you are asking my theory about why Trump admires these people. I think because he admires the fact that they get things done. And this is what George Bernard Shaw said about, he listed a whole bunch of people like Stalin, Mussolini, and lesser figures of the period. And he said he admired them because they got things done. But with Trump, you could also add that Trump also admires their authoritarian style. Even though Trump doesn't have the kind of power hunger which his people had, we are talking about, but he still admired somebody who can exercise power efficiently. And probably Trump also has great contempt for intellectuals, I would expect. Since they don't like him, so...
Except Stephen Bannon.
Yeah.
Would you accept my description
Yes, he's an intellectual.
of, quote, my Steve, unquote, as an intellectual?
He's an intellectual. So was Goebbels, you know. He wrote his PhD on romantic literature and so forth, and was extremely well read.
Yeah, what do you, so was that me?
Pardon?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. What do you think of what Kojève said about why intellectuals, so in this case, including himself, first-hand source, are interested in tyrants? And he said it's because they want to figure out the truth. They don't want to be stuck. They've got all these ideas about politics and justice and so on. And they don't want to be stuck just talking to people about it, because the people they're going to talk to are going to be their friends who are going to say, yeah, I agree with you, you're part of my school. You can get outside of your school of thought a little bit, but really he thought to figure out whether you're onto something, you need to be directly influencing the world, and the fastest way to do that is to look for a tyrant, because that's how you change things.
Yeah, but I think I made a very similar point earlier, that intellectuals appreciated the fact that these tyrants, the dictators, brought together ends and means, theory and practice. And they had the power to do it, and they had the ideas to implement, and that impressed them.
So therefore, the thinkers who don't do that, who we're inclined to think of as superior, I mean, according to Kojève, that they're just missing something. They're not serious enough about.
Well, that's hard to know, you know, how serious people are about their avowed opinions or beliefs. I think the admiration of the dictators was quite genuine, but also, I didn't mention this earlier, which is quite obvious, that many of the intellectuals who admired these dictators, they didn't actually know all the terrible massacres they perpetuated. So, or didn't know and didn't want to know. Or on rare occasions, somebody would say, and I quoted an American writer, Sinclair Lewis or Upton Sinclair, I confused them. One of them said that, well, yes, Stalin killed a lot of people in the course of collectivization, but that was a great social improvement to collectivize agriculture. And more recently, Eric Hobsbawm said, I quoted this in this book, Eric Hobsbawm said that somebody asked him that would he have supported the Soviet regime in the 1930s if he had known about the purges and the number of people killed at the time. And after some hesitation, he said, yes, he would have supported it, because after all, that was the only system which promised a very different and appealing future to mankind, or to the people of the Soviet Union. So again, that's an example of the importance of good intentions.
I have a little bit of a different take on people who voted for Trump, and I wonder what you might think of it. I lived in Cincinnati for decades in a non-academic community with my businessman husband, and my sense was that a lot of people who voted for Trump were very focused on policy, as opposed to the intellectuals who were focused on personalities. They were appalled by intellectually inspired policies, and the Boy Girl Scouts now is a great example. The political correctness they were appalled with, but they were also very focused on foreign policy. They saw the world exploding all over. They were against the Iran nuke deal, against the way we appeased North Korea, and they were against the reset with Russia. So I think a lot of people ended up voting for Trump because he won the primary, and he was anti all these things they were against. And I have found it interesting that a lot of intellectuals, when they criticize Trump, are exclusively focused on his personality and his bombastic rhetoric, and are actually getting away with not assessing his policies, for example, or his administration's policies toward North Korea. So I just wanted to throw that out as a totally different perspective. And I would love You mentioned your some literature where you discuss the appearance-reality dichotomy in modern life and romanticization of love, and I would love to know the names of some of those books.
But there is this one book which is called Extravagant Expectations. That's the title of the book. And the subtitle is something like The American Approach to Romantic Love, or The American Way of Romantic Love, something like that. And it came out a few years ago. But about I never suggested that Trump was admired for the same reasons as intellectuals admired these dictators. I think Trump is admired, I think, because he can express, and that doesn't contradict necessarily what you said, but I think Trump is primarily admired because he can very successfully express the grievances and the resentments of people. He's very good at that, and denounce their shared enemies. He's very good at denouncing their enemies, this mythical elite. And you could also say, I have written this somewhere, that you could also look at the Trump phenomenon as a reaction to, a lot of the 60s, or what was left behind by the 60s. You could say, well, political correctness, multiculturalism, all these things which people have reacted against, non-academic people. And Trump seems to personify these somewhat inarticulate or incoherent nostalgic desires for a better past, or fantasies about a better past. And a lot of these people thought they had better chances or higher social status in the past. And probably quite possible also that Trump's popularity also has to do with his hostility to Obama. So we can also bring in the matter of racism. But again, clearly there are very few, I can think of very few intellectuals who support Trump or supported Trump. So this is a different phenomenon. And let's call them the more ordinary people. Well, again, what is hard to know, what proportion of these Trump supporters support him for these alleged more economic reasons, like the coal miners losing their job, and he's believing that he will bring back these jobs. That's one type of supporter. But I think it's a broader kind of frustration or grievance, what these people feel, that somehow they lost status in this modern 21st century United States, and that Trump is somehow going to restore it in some mysterious way.
Yes.
Thanks. Thanks for the talk. A couple answers ago, you made this remark that Western intellectuals at some point were not aware of what was happening inside these regimes. I'm thinking here more of the communist experience. And but I was wondering if you could clarify how do you envision this happening in terms of after, for instance, for instance, the Prague invasion, after the 20th Soviet Communist Party Congress, in which Khrushchev himself recognized all the crimes, etc., etc. So, how is it possible that intellectuals were not aware of what was happening? That's first. And at the same time, you could see support for totalitarian communism shifting from Soviet version, and in the early 60s shifting towards Chinese version, and then looking for some third world versions, as if they were looking for some next tentative approach to the experience that would correct initial mistakes that were done with the theory, and would correct and apply it and make it work, as it were. So, but do you really think that they didn't know they didn't want to know, or how come they still sort of, let me put it another way. I'm Portuguese originally, and in 1974 we have a revolution, and we have a leader of a very strong party who lived in Moscow for, I don't know, 10 years perhaps, and he was very much well aware of what was happening in the Soviet reality. But still, he wanted to implement what we could call a communist regime in the country. So how could he not know?
Well, I think that there have been obviously several types of people. Like the latter one was an example of a person who was a true believer, and he thought that the sacrifices and the bloodshed is justified by the policies and the goals of the regime. You know, like the American writer I mentioned, who thought that the collectivization was bloody, but still it was a very good thing, so it was justified. Now, I think it is difficult to know to what extent people knew about the specifics, you know. I mean, compared with Nazism, everybody has seen pictures of Nazi concentration camp, because of course the Allies liberated them, took pictures and made movies. Very few people have ever seen a picture of a Soviet or Chinese or a Cuban concentration camp. So I think there is also this matter of visual images. I think that helped ignorance, that when you knew certain things in theory, like you know, there have been a so-called Soviet revisionist academics who would say, well, yes, there were some people killed in the purges, but not millions, only hundreds of thousands. Well, you know, that kind of argument. So it's difficult to know. And then again, you have all these people whom I wrote about in this old book, The Political Pilgrims, who actually went to these countries and they were shown model prisons. You know, they specifically had model prisons in the Soviet Union and China too, and I think in Cuba too. So there were some deliberate attempts to mislead. But when you talk about the speech of Khrushchev, that obviously is a major historical event, and some people argue that that was really the source of the collapse of Soviet communism, such a major delegitimation. But again, even though he said these things about Stalin, first of all, he blamed everything wrong with the Soviet system on Stalin. So that in itself was a very erroneous and un-Marxist position. But again, even if you blamed everything on Stalin, and Western intellectuals knew about this, they still didn't have specific information about what exactly transpired in the Soviet Union during collectivization or during the purge trials. And I think it's also very difficult to imagine. I think that's a good example. And this has been a Soviet practice, which was adopted in the other communist countries. These show trials, when you drag people in court and they will recite confessions which they learned to recite under extreme physical and mental pressure. But it's very difficult to understand that this can be done. So I think it's a mixed bag. I think some intellectuals knew certain things and others didn't know. And insofar as they idealized the Soviet system or the Chinese system, I mean, about China, it was even more difficult to know. Now, how many people knew that, you know, under this great leap forward, it was this crazy attempt to industrialize and melt down everything, including agricultural implements, that millions of people died of starvation. So it was difficult to know the specifics.
Yeah.
Some intellectuals and non-intellectuals, I include myself in one of them, admire people like Lincoln, Churchill, de Gaulle, FDR, and the way these people are superior to us, they have a certain charisma, there was something salvific or redemptive about what they all did. And it suggests that this kind of admiration, either healthy or not healthy, is at least natural, not just part of the communist experience or fascist experience of admiring dictators. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about what are healthy versions of this kind of admiration that distinguishes them from unhealthy, or do you think they're all unhealthy? And you should be skeptical of all of these. And it's pretenses of superiority.
No, I wouldn't say that, every kind of admiration for some great historical figure is pathological, and clearly one should be able to make some distinctions among people who deserve to be admired and others who don't. So, I am not a relativist in these matters, and some people deserve admiration, and probably more of them don't. Please.
Following up Dan's question in a positive direction, the dismal tale that you've been sharing, which is no doubt true, also makes me wonder, are there any examples that you've come across of intellectuals whose advice or whose work, writing, had a positive impact on the dictator of choice?
Well, I don't know. That's difficult to think about. I have listings, as I said before, in my last chapter of intellectuals who never admired these systems for various reasons. But you are asking about intellectuals whose advice might have played a positive part. And, well, that's difficult to think of this because the dictators didn't want to hear critical or dissenting voices. So I can't think of any of these people who would dare to criticize the dictators and who would think that I was thinking of one example which doesn't quite fit in, but there was one instance where an intellectual was personally close to a dictators, and that was Hitler and Speer. And they had much mutual regard. But I don't think that Speer would actually tell Hitler that, you are going too far. I mean, he would say he would say that, it's better to use the Jews as a force of labor than to gas them. But that was not necessarily on humanitarian grounds, but on economic, utilitarian grounds. So, he might have exerted this kind of little bit of a moderating influence, but I doubt. And actually, in the Soviet or Russian case, these dictators, I think they came to believe their own propaganda that they were infallible, and they didn't want to hear criticism, I think.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. As a fellow alum of UMass Amherst, I wish your message had been heeded more by UMass Amherst professors. Quick comment and question. We can talk about intellectuals as idealists, but in a way they're very pessimistic about the future, in the sense that they believe that we can't rely on fellow human beings and our fellow neighbor to resolve some social difficulties that they feel authoritarian would be able to solve. And on a related note, I don't see how there's any less danger in the soft despotism of policy in comparison to the hard despotism of tyranny or authoritarianism. And I'm wondering, going forward, if the challenge for the 21st century is to recognize and diagnose the dangers of soft despotism through policy, as opposed to the hard despotism of personality, which I feel like today we're more able to identify in a more clear fashion.
But I don't know what is your example or case of soft despotism.
So for the idea that even the idea of implementing a particular policy in itself would be able to resolve the social problem. As another thing is sort of the Tocquevillian notion of administrative despotism, in the sense that the threat today is not necessarily from a Hitler, but from a faceless bureaucrat who's implementing a policy with accountability that can still wreak havoc or some social problems on our personal lives. Is that a problem going forward in the 21st century as opposed to 20th century problems?
You see, I don't see this concept of soft despotism as very clear-cut, because you would say that many of the dictators, even the very brutal dictators, they also relied very heavily on propaganda. So they actually might have preferred to persuade people to behave in the way they wanted to behave and not use high levels of coercion or political violence. And so I don't see a very clear-cut case of this soft despotism. I know that people have been using this concept with regard to, more with regard to American society, that somehow, we are coerced or influenced or manipulated, by corporations mainly. I think this is basically a kind of an anti-capitalist notion that, and I think in a way, sort of this idea, I think, goes back a bit to Marcuse. He had similar ideas, this kind of repression. What was his term? What kind of repression? Marcuse used the term of some kind of repression, which is that's kind of soft repression, but that wasn't exactly the word he used. That American society is very good at manipulating people without overt coercion, and I don't know whether or not this is true or not. Very difficult to evaluate, and I think it's probably somewhat exaggerated, this idea, but I don't know. I haven't given it enough thought.
Yeah. Monty.
I wanted to offer a couple of examples of dictators who might have benefited from intellectuals in the positive way, at least as far as we can see. But I grew up in Pinochet's Chile. And I think it's an interesting example because he came from a very strong statist tradition and clearly had very conservative tendencies, but was heavily influenced by economic libertarianism and the Chicago School, for example. Milton Friedman visited Chile several times when I was a child, and I remember it being an event like the Pope's visit. So it was an interesting transformation. Of course, the other obvious one is Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, who clearly ruled as a dictator and still does through his descendants in a one-party state. But I think nobody here would say that his use of intellectuals was, well, I'm sure it was definitely to glorify himself, but without question, a great benefit to an entire nation. So I think that sometimes we get caught up in the use of the word dictator, but these were, by most accounts of dictatorship, dictators. And yet they were influenced in a positive way. So I just wanted to enrich your...
I appreciate it.
No.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I wonder how we can explain the case of intellectuals who made the same mistake twice or more. Someone like Harrison Salisbury, a New York Times correspondent in Moscow who was very enthusiastic about the Soviet Union. Several decades later, he went to China during the height of the Cultural Revolution, and he talked about how the food was nice and the people are lovely and the countryside looks great and everything is just fantastic. Meanwhile, millions of people are dropping like flies. So how many more genocides does it take to convince some people, or is the search for utopia endless? It is the lack of willingness to learn from your mistakes, in some ways even more horrifying than the mistake itself.
Yes, I am aware of this phenomenon. I had a few cases in the book, both in the old political privilege and this one. I mentioned some cases who were this kind of repeat offenders, There was this, who first, a familiar pattern was from the admiration of the Soviet Union, who moved to the admiration of China under Mao and Castro's Cuba. This was a very familiar pattern. And then finally the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And now we sort of ran out of them at the moment. But, and yes, I think the only way you can explain it that you have to descend into psychological explanations here, that these people had obviously a very strong need to remain true believers in something. And they found it.
I'm just thinking of other good examples, like Hamilton or Jefferson. But the example I'd love you to talk about would be a much more ambiguous one, which is Salazar in Portugal.
Well, my knowledge of American history is shaky. I didn't go to high school in this country, and I didn't major in history, so
It wouldn't help if you had.
I know it would. So, I mean, I have only one little personal anecdote I can tell you about Salazar. When I first went to Portugal in the late 1950s, when I was still an undergraduate at LSE. And I went to a bookstore in Lisbon, and I was surprised to see that they have a lot of books by Marx and Lenin and things like that. And then I somehow, I don't know who I talked about this, somebody in Portugal, and they said that Salazar doesn't care about letting people read these things because very few people would read them anyway. So that many of them who were dissenters, they were not translated into Portuguese. So that was again a control. In other words, he was not a totalitarian dictator. He didn't care about making things so seamless and foolproof. But I mean, I don't know more about Salazar.
Are you surprised that more intellectuals don't admire Kim Jong-un, or do you think they some secretly do?
Well, that's a good point. I wrote a little bit about the North Korean dynasty in this book, and about the small number of admirers. But there have been a few of the king of this dynasty, and about the current leader. Well, I mean, it's just really difficult. It's just difficult because it's difficult for this system to project this kind of image, which the other communist states were more successful at projecting. And there is this, one well-known American historian at the University of Chicago, whom I quoted in the book, Cummings, I think, who is a great supporter of North Korea and has been for a long time. And I don't know, I just think that there is, maybe there is a limit to the nonsense people can believe.
Your whole career suggests otherwise.
Well, thanks so much, Paul. This has been quite wonderful.
Space. I once had an office in what was then the Russian Research Center. And I was a fellow at the Russian Research Center at the beginning of my academic career, while I was an assistant professor in social relations. So this talk and the book, which is the focus of the talk, reflects my very long-standing preoccupations, which obviously have a lot to do with my background. And as Harvey said, I grew up in Hungary. I was born in Hungary and grew up in Hungary, which was not a very pleasant place to be between the two world wars and after World War II. So I had some personal experiences with Nazism and as well as Stalinism. And I escaped after the '56 revolution. And after that, I led a rather calm academic life, contrasted with the life in East Europe. Well, my preoccupations have been fairly consistent. I sort of started out as a Sovietologist and wrote about the Soviet Union. And then I became more interested in the Western, especially intellectuals' perception of communist systems. And more generally, I have become interested in the connections between intellectuals and politics, and also interested in the interactions or the interdependence of the personal and the political realm, like in my case, how personal experiences influence political interests or attitudes. So I wrote a fair amount about these matters. Anti-Americanism is another reflection of the same interests. Much of it really dealt with, about the attitudes of American intellectuals towards their own society, in addition to intellectuals and other groups around the world. Now, this current book I am trying to discuss briefly indeed was similar in some ways to Political Pilgrims, in that it reflects this long-standing preoccupation with intellectuals and politics. And beyond that, my interest in how people deal with a huge amount of political power like these dictators who ran these systems. And well, as to the spiritual discontents of modernity, as in the title, well, that's a very broad way of looking at this matter, and I tried, perhaps unwisely, to make some huge generalizations about the motivation and the background of intellectuals who were attracted to these very dissimilar, in some ways dissimilar, in some ways similar political systems, you know, the communist ones and fascist Italy and Nazi Germany and some others in the current Arab world. So actually my view of Western intellectuals and their political misjudgments or misperceptions was based largely, not so much as some other people argued that intellectuals wanted to have power, but my judgment was somewhat more charitable. I thought they were idealistic, and they wanted to do good or have people they perceived as doing good. I don't think they actually wanted power. Well, some of them did, but most of them I don't think did want to have power. I mean, they wanted to make some difference. They wanted to have their ideas to be taken seriously. But anyway, so these are some of the similarities. I also, of course, came to the conclusion that certainly when I started working on political pilgrims, the prevailing views of intellectuals have been altogether too rosy and indulgent, and the kinds of views, I can't resist quoting one of them, at least one example. This is from Edward Said and what he said about intellectuals. He said that the figure of the intellectual as a being set apart, someone able to speak the truth, a courageous and angry individual for whom no worldly power is too big and imposing to be criticized and pointedly taken to the task. And he also said that further on that the real or true intellectual is always an outsider living in self-imposed, seamlessly integrated exile on the margins of society. And of course, this didn't exactly apply to him being on the margins of society as a university professor at Columbia and having many of his books made into required reading on many campuses. But I think this was a kind of exalted view of intellectuals, and I think many intellectuals still would like to think that perhaps this applies. I have always been criticized about overgeneralizing about intellectuals, and so I hasten to add that it's hard to know, what proportion of intellectuals in Western societies, including the United States, should be the subject of this kind of criticism, because after all, we don't have opinion or attitude surveys addressed to intellectuals as such. And all we can say, that there is a large and vocal portion of intellectuals, mostly these days in departments in the social sciences and humanities at American and other Western universities, who may be characterized in the ways I have characterized them. Now, as to the personal and the political, well, that's another interesting issue, because, of course, on the one hand, we would like to take the position that our personal experiences, that our work in some ways should be independent of our personal experiences, that it should be objective or impartial in some ways. But I think this is difficult to come to a satisfactory conclusion, because obviously I can't say that my own personal experiences in Nazism and communism make my work irrelevant or questionable. Of course, it has made me judgmental. That has been, of course, a problem in our academic world in the last few decades. We have been cautioned many times not to be judgmental. But of course, if you look at this matter more closely, you find that everybody is judgmental, including those who advise us not to be judgmental. Only people are judgmental in a selective way. And I don't think much can be done about it.
This is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Paul Hollander. He's a professor emeritus of sociology at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and he's a longtime teacher in the sociology and social relations department at Harvard. He's born in Hungary, same year that I was, turns out. He got his BA from London School of Economics and his PhD from Princeton in sociology. He's, I think, was first best known for his book Political Pilgrims in 1989. And it's, I think, fair to say that the theme of his work has been, you might say, the sins of 20th century intellectuals. Mention some of the other books that he's done, The Many Faces of Socialism, 1983, Survival of the Adversary Culture, Decline and Discontent, Anti-American Critiques, Political Will and Personal Belief, Some Discontents, Postmodern and Post-Communist, The Only Superpower in 2009, and his latest that I'll talk a little bit about today, has recently come out from Cambridge Press, From Benito Mussolini to Hugo Chavez, Intellectuals and a Century of Political Hero Worship. So, Paul Hollander.
Thank you, Harvey. It's a great pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me. This is not working and my voice is not very strong, but I hope you can hear me. I appreciate this invitation, partly because I have, as Harvey hinted, I had some emotional connection with this area. In fact, on this very